Welcome everybody. Welcome to Sustainable Superheroes. This is our 10th episode. In our last webinar, we spoke with Barrett Holmes about biodiversity planning for new housing developments, and we're going to be continuing that theme around biodiversity for the next couple of events. We're going to shift our focus away from development into identifying opportunities for biodiversity enhancement and the process through which landowners can establish and trade in natural capital markets. And more specifically, how you can manage and trade BNG offsets as an environment bank or within a group. This could be beneficial both to landowners seeking to provide offsets from their land, but also to developers that wish to trade internally within the group, or just simply like to understand a little bit more about how they might be, what they're buying, and how it can top up as an offsite credit to the more challenging BNG plans. So please give a warm welcome for my guest today, Henry Parkinson from Langley Abbey Environmental Project. Henry is a specialist in planning and infrastructure lawyer and has spent the last 4 years advising clients on biodiversity net gain. In December 2023, Henry left private practice to join Langley Abbey Estate. He's a practicing solicitor and oversees all legal aspects of the project, and is a member of the UK Environmental Law Association and National Infrastructure Planning Association. So please give a warm welcome to Henry. And let's start, Henry, as we normally do on this show, with a bit of an overview of the project at Langley Abbey and your role.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen. Pleasure to be speaking to you today, and great to be keeping the focus on biodiversity for a little bit longer. Langley Abbey Environment Project is a 250-hectare landscape recovery and habitat creation project in the Broads National Park here in South Norfolk, where we're seeking to return the Langley Abbey estate to nature. So we are restoring approximately 200 hectares of arable farmland and replacing it with a mosaic of different priority habitats, things like wildflower meadows, traditional orchards, ponds, extending the existing hedgerow and watercourse network across the estate. And we're also working to enhance about 50 hectares of deep peat marshland, carr woodland, wet woodland, and reed beds. So enhancing those not only to improve the biodiversity value for wildlife, but also to conserve the world's most effective carbon stores. My role at Langley Abbey Environment Project really spans everything from stakeholder engagement right the way through to marketing the project and utilising emerging natural capital markets like biodiversity net gain. And obviously, as you've explained, I'm a planning lawyer, and so it would be remiss of me not to oversee all legal aspects of the project.
Fantastic. And can you say a little bit more about the plan at Langley, more about the timescales as well, because you guys are a little bit ahead now. You're almost at the point of creating the units this year, aren't you?
Yeah, so we're delivering the project in phases, and phase one will be delivered on the ground this coming autumn. It will see the creation of about 30 hectares of wildflower meadows and the planting of half a kilometre of hedgerows. As I've touched upon, we're seeking to utilise BNG to direct finance into the project, and part of that process is covenanting the land through a legal agreement to generate those biodiversity units that can then be sold. And we're currently in the process of negotiating that agreement. We hope to have that wrapped up shortly and our land allocated onto the biodiversity gain site register. That phase will deliver just over 225 area units of medium distinctiveness habitat, as well as 5 high distinctiveness hedgerow units. The project, as you can see on the screen here, it straddles 2 local planning authorities and 2 national character areas. And so the units really hold much of their value from North Norfolk down to North Essex. What you're looking at there in orange is the boundaries for the local planning authorities. So you see that the Langley estate straddles South Norfolk and the Broads Authority. And in blue there is the national character areas. So to the west of the estate, you've got the South Norfolk and High Suffolk Claylands National Character Area, and to the east, you've got the Broads National Character Area. And really, BNG is the first time that these 2 boundaries have been viewed in the same sort of context. So this plan is just quite a useful indication as to how different those boundaries actually are, particularly in Norfolk and Suffolk. The national character areas they're not uniform, and there really isn't much correlation between them and the local planning authorities. So just really something for people to be aware of from all perspectives, really, from the sort of landowner side, developers, but also local planning authorities and potentially responsible bodies as well.
I'm glad you mentioned it. It does show quite a big difference between the Boundary Reserve, the NCA, and the LPAs, actually. Sorry,
Yeah.
go on. You were saying a phased approach.
Well, a phased approach really helps us to do two things. We can gradually cease arable farming across the estate, but it also allows us to be a little bit more responsive and react to the BNG market, which is still emerging. So we're fortunate with our scale and the circumstances that we've got some flexibility. We can react to that and expedite future phases if need be. But there's also the opportunity to have that kind of gradual cessation.
So we'll start with why the estate owners decided to do this. What made this such a good opportunity for creating an environment bank and offsets?
Yeah, I think personally, and certainly for us at Langley Abbey, it's fundamental to begin with the ecological considerations. And in that sense, habitat connectivity is key. Is really what drew me away from private practice and a kind of focus on advising developer clients on complying with BNG and looking to do what they can within their own red line, to really focusing instead on maximising what can be achieved through BNG by delivering strategic projects. And so the slide on the screen there, it's just a good portrayal as to how Langley Abbey Estate is surrounded by designated sites. We've got 2,500 hectares of triple SIs within a 10-kilometre radius of the estate, many of which make up the Broads, which, for those of you that know the area, it's a Ramsar site, it's a special protection area, special area of conservation, important bird area, important plant area, important invertebrate area. It's one of the most protected and designated sites in the country, and for good reasons. It's one of the most ecologically distinctive. So we need to do everything we can to support and conserve the Broads and the broadland environment, but also to complement it and enhance it where we can. The Langley Abbey Estate straddles all four of Natural England's habitat network. So we know that across the estate, we've got opportunities to connect fragmented habitats, extend the habitats that already exist, but also enhance those with others that don't currently exist. And Grafton's a really good example of that. Norfolk and Suffolk are relatively grassland poor counties because there's so much arable farming. And we've got parts of the estate that, because of the topography and the hydrology, it would be wrong for us to try and recreate a wetland environment. But by complementing the kind of wetland broadland landscape with grassland habitats, we're contributing to a much broader ecosystem functionality.
Location is so important here for major projects. Can you say what's happening to the farm then? So I know you said it was in a phased approach, but what happens next?
So conventional arable farming across the estate will cease. There's a shift in what we're doing on the estate. There's a shift in focus from arable production to conservation for wildlife, but we're still creating habitats that can contribute to farming and to food production. And it's certainly not the end of farming across the estate. So grassland habitats are a great example. Hay meadows require an annual hay cut. That's part of the annual maintenance of that habitat. That hay can obviously then be supplied as feed for livestock. Those same hay meadows need to be kept low, the sward height low throughout the winter months. And there's an opportunity for livestock grazing throughout the winter months. We're fortunate at the estate that we've also got marshland. And so we have an opportunity to graze livestock on the marshland in the summer when they need to be off the hay meadows, because you need the wildflowers to germinate, to grow, and to set seed. And then come the winter months, when the marshland is likely to be too waterlogged for grazing, then that same livestock can go onto the meadows and spend the winter there. So very kind of complementary, symbiotic situation, and still a continuation of farming on the estate, albeit the priority and the focus is definitely changing.
Can you say a little bit more about why the location is such a key importance for projects like this? I think when we said a lot about conservation part of this, but could you say a little bit more about the commercial considerations as well in that particular region?
Yeah, dealing with why location is so important. Habitat connectivity is fundamental to BNG because BNG uses habitats as a proxy for species abundance. And of course, if you don't have connectivity with those habitats, then you're unable to really attract the wildlife to what you've created in the first place. And you're not able to thereafter support an ecosystem for a sustained period of time. Commercially, Langley Abbey Estate is in East Anglia. It's a region in need of considerable house building to meet demand, and also to compensate for a couple of years of delay through nutrient neutrality. Norfolk and Suffolk is also the DCO capital of the world, of England rather. There's lots of infrastructure projects coming forward, real emphasis on offshore wind in the North Sea. And alongside that, you've got a real emphasis in the region on science and technology. So Norwich to Cambridge is typically known as the tech corridor. So there's lots of forthcoming development in the region, and at 250 hectares generating about 2,000 BNG units, we hope to be able to supply some of that demand.
Fantastic. And so the value proposition here, I think that the message is location, size, current land use all contribute towards the decision to change and understand the ecological opportunities, commercial benefits. But is this, and I think we could probably lose the slide as well now, Amarjeet, thank you. Is this unique just to the estate, and what would you advise for other landowners?
Yeah, it's certainly not unique to Langley Abbey, but it's definitely central to why we're delivering the project. We're fortunate enough, as we touched upon before coming on air, that we're opposite the Mid-Yare National Nature Reserve. It's a fantastic wetland expanse, the reed fen and meadows and wet woodland, owned and operated by the RSPB, and it's literally the other side of the River Yare to us. And so we're able to really build an extension, if you like, and bolt on 250 hectares of effort onto that existing landscape. But of course, there's national and local nature reserves up and down the country. And an example, just down in Devon recently, I saw that the Pebblehead Heaths Natural Nature Reserve has been extended by 90 hectares. So these opportunities to build on efforts onto existing sites will present themselves the country over. It's not unique to Langley. In terms of advice, my advice to landowners would be just to take that step back, just take a wide angle lens on this for a minute and just see what would your efforts do? How would you contribute to the wider landscape? Are you going to deliver that kind of habitat connectivity? Can you bolt your efforts on like they've done at Pebblehead Heaths or we're trying to do with the Mid-Yare? Can you work with neighbours to bring forward a project that extends over a much larger area of land than just your own land holding? And if you look at things like your local plan, any supplementary planning documents, the local nature recovery strategies once they're developed, these are all documents where you'll be pointed towards the most appropriate opportunities for strategic conservation efforts, and that will really help focus attention in the right areas.
Wonderful. We're going to come back to that process in a moment, along with some of the skills that are required to make this happen. But can you say a bit more about the different types of habitat banks and the role that the estate has taken here? And I see that Amarjeet's already jumped ahead with a kind of worked example already on this on the slideshow. But if we start with a little bit about what's the difference in habitat banks.
I wish I'd triple check my maths because it was never my strong point at school, but it's been on the screen for a long while now. Yeah, so different approaches, habitat banking. We are adopting a habitat banking approach at Langley Abbey in its most conventional sense. So we are committing to create the habitat and actually creating the habitat up front. And effectively, we're generating a bank of units that we can then draw down upon and sell and allocate to developers over a period of time. And that's where the phrase habitat banking really stems from. Landowners are rewarded for doing that in a couple of ways. One of them is the temporal multiplier that's worked into the biodiversity metric, of which we've got an example on the screen to step through. It's a little bit technical how it works, but hopefully this does a good job of explaining it. We'll use phase 1 of Langley Abbey Environment Project, this example, and I won't give the figures after the decimal points because it'll twist my tongue a little bit too much. But let's start with 30 hectares of land, and that generates 225 area units. Let's assume in year 1, we sell 52 units. 52 units, the maths is on the screen there, but the important thing to realise, 52 units represent 23% of the total units available, and 23% of the total land available is 7 hectares. So at the end of year 1, if we've sold 52 units, really what we've done is we've sold our ability to generate habitat creation and enhancement across 7 hectares of phase 1. So what does that leave us with? 26 hectares upon which to continue selling units, continue selling habitat enhancement. And those remaining units have the temporal multiplier applied to them. It's a 3% uplift. So as we move into year 2, we've got 23 hectares remaining. We've got 172 units as of their year 1 value, but they've been uplifted by 3%. So you've actually got 177 units. And if you step through then year 2 and assume we sell 94 units, 94 units is 53% of those 177 remaining. 53% of the remaining area, those 23 hectares, is 12 hectares. So at the end of year 2, we're left with 11 hectares upon which to sell our units. And of course, it's not shown on this slide, although it is on the next one. Those 83 units that are left, they similarly benefit from the 3% uplift at the end of year 2. So if we could just move on to the next slide, it shows the same maths, albeit in a slightly different format. And really what's important to look at here is the column on the right-hand side, the unit density. So you see when we start off with 30 hectares and 225 units, that those 30 hectares are producing a unit density of 7 units per hectare. And actually what happens on an annual basis is that unit density is uplifted by 3%. There are figures after the 2 beyond the decimal point, which means it doesn't quite tally so neatly, but it's a 0.22% increase really, which is why you go from 7.36 to 5.8 and on to 7.9 and 8.1 and so on and so forth. You're looking at 8.23 and 8.54 for years 5 and 6. And that goes on an annual basis. Why does that happen? It's incentivizing landowners for committing to habitat creation up front. And clearly, if we're trying to reduce species decline and improve biodiversity, the sooner we begin on the ground, the better. And it's also rewarding developers from purchasing units that are closer to being established. So the idea is if you're buying a unit that was created 3 or 4 or 10 years ago, it's much more likely that habitat is going to go on and succeed and meet its target condition at the end of its covenant period. So alongside the kind of financial incentive that the temporal multiplier brings, there are other benefits to habitat banking in this way. Really, the big kind of value is the speed and effectiveness at which you can operate. Your product, your units are swift and streamlined, and if a developer needs them, you can sell them and allocate them, almost immediately. Of course, there's a big risk with this approach in that you are committing to and creating something up front without the security of any revenue being generated. Typically, there'll be high capital expenditure at the outset. You're foregoing existing land use and future land use across your land, and you've got 30 years of legal obligations too. It's not without risk, but the rewards are there if you're willing to take them. There's another kind of habitat banking option, sort of habitat banking delayed, that kind of mitigates that risk. You could commit to create the habitat upfront, but actually wait to engage a buyer before you create the habitat. The problem with that approach is that the same temporal multiplier that incentivizes upfront delivery is also going to penalize you for delayed delivery. It works in much the same way. On a 3% basis per annum, the unit density across the land that you're creating habitat is going to reduce, it's going to diminish. A way to mitigate the risk entirely and also mitigate the temporal multiplier is a sort of bespoke arrangement. Landowners could wait to actually identify and line up a buyer before creating or before even committing to create the habitat. A perfectly sensible approach. The problem you're going to have adopting that is it's going to be difficult for you to compete with other habitat banks that have already got their units generated. Because if you haven't begun that process of your legal agreement and your units aren't even registered on the Gainsight register, you're looking at a few months before you can really sell them to a developer. And in the meantime, I wouldn't be surprised if a developer seeks units elsewhere that are much more readily available and can be allocated immediately. Just for completeness, the last kind of option that I should throw in there, it's not something we're utilising, but there are habitat bank operators that landowners can work with. They tend to operate on a leasehold model. They will take a leasehold interest in your land for typically a minimum of 30 years, often 33. As a landowner, you're paid a lease premium and management fee to manage the land for the covenant period. The benefit is you get security of revenue, your annual lease payment and your management payment contingent on the unit sales. The downside is that you don't receive the sale proceeds of the units, and typically the annual lease premium and the management fee are very modest relative to the potential profits that can be generated by the unit sales. So there's 4 different approaches. There's no right or wrong answer. It will come down to landowners, their risk appetite and their ability to market their projects, really.
Terrific, thank you. We're going to move on to the next section. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned natural capital markets. So can we say a little bit more about, and we're assuming there is carbon offsets, nutrient neutrality, but what offsets are you aiming to develop and how do you prioritize what to tackle first?
Yeah, our principal focus is biodiversity net gain. It's not a voluntary market in the same way that carbon credits is. There's a mandatory element to it. Yeah. And we expect the demand to be greater and we expect the market price to remain higher than carbon credits. That said, there will be opportunities for us to reassess that, particularly across the sort of wetland phase of the project over the marshland. That sits atop of 3 meters of peat. And peatlands are the world's largest land stores of carbon. In terms of our global efforts to mitigate climate change, it's absolutely fundamental. We do everything we can to conserve and enhance the peatlands that we have. And so we're looking at restoring some natural hydrology across the peat marshland, and that could, of course, generate carbon credits. So it'd be something for us to reassess a little bit down the line. In terms of nutrient neutrality and nutrient credits, undoubtedly what we're doing across the estate is improving water quality and reducing the amount of nutrients in the River Yare and local watercourses. At the moment, we sit just outside the surface water catchment zone for the River Yare. So we're not able to evidence tangible mitigation through what we're doing and sell those as nutrient credits. Obviously, if the catchment zone is extended at any point in the future, we are literally on the edge of it. So we're well placed to then go on and actually sell credits if and when that happens.
There's any real difference in how you manage those credits, or are they undertaken the same way as BNG?
Yeah, there's not really any difference in what you do on the ground. The sort of actions and the outcomes are the same. So if you take BNG and carbon credits, so you might be planting a woodland, you might be re-wetting peatland. Both of those actions are going to have a biodiversity uplift. They're also going to sequester carbon. You don't really, depending on which one you want to utilize, isn't really going to affect what you do on the ground. What you do need to do is work out before you commit to it in a legal agreement which avenue you want to pursue, because you can't stack carbon credits and BNG. And so if you've legally committed to carry out some actions, what you can't then do is try and benefit from the sort of natural capital uplift of the other avenue. So you want to have your ducks in a row in that sense, but on the ground, what you deliver will often be very similar.
And how do you decide which one to take on first? What's the kind of key ingredients in that decision, if you like?
There's a number of factors. I guess location is a fairly obvious one. Are you within a nutrient catchment zone? Can you actually sell nutrient credits? Are you in an area of high development? Would BNG be a sensible option? Are you close to a sewage outfall? Might be a partnership opportunity with a local water authority. You could be in a heavy industrial region. You might have large industrial emitters that could partner with you and purchase your carbon credits. Location is obviously a key factor. So too is the land that you're working with, the sort of ecological aspects. Have you got deep peat beneath your land? Because if so, you could be generating carbon credits. So if you've got a woodland that you can extend or enhance, then likewise, carbon could be the route that you go down. If you've got a river running through your land, then that might impact, you might lean towards nutrient credits. From a commercial perspective, there may be an opportunity to benefit from the actions in a kind of an additional way. So at Langley Abbey, certainly in terms of bringing forward grassland habitats and producing an annual hay cut, the Townsend family own and run a horse feed company called Feedmark. So there's already an avenue and a marketplace for us to sell the sort of byproduct of our conservation effort. So clearly creating a grassland habitat in that instance makes more commercial sense than planting woodland. And then I think this is a slightly less important, less tangible, but I think it's relevant. Look at the sort of amenity value of the land. If a landowner is choosing to change the way that they manage their estate, then they should be able to enjoy the benefits and the repercussions. Now, clearly, improving biodiversity is objectively a good thing, but if you like the idea of walking through woodland with your grandchildren, and then plant woodland, and if you want to attract breeding waders and wildfowl to your estate, then ponds and scrapes and enhancing and planting reed beds is going to be your best bet. Don't do that if it contradicts sound ecological practices. But if you've got a choice of a couple of habitats that are both viable and sensible and deliverable, then go with your heart and the one that you want to see on your estate.
Thank you. Let's walk through the process. You mentioned there are differing skill sets needed. Can you explain a bit about what's needed as we step through the process of how do you want to take this whole thing? Where do you start? What steps do you have to walk through to get to selling a credit?
Yeah, I will, by all means, I'll speak to BNG specifically, if that's okay, and also adopt the habitat banking creation upfront approach that we've discussed. But there are similarities with nutrient credits and carbon credits, slightly different metric and covenant period and registration process, but the broad principles are the same. And you obviously begin with that sort of appraisal of land and opportunities, it's the options and alternatives piece that we've just discussed. From a BNG perspective, it's particularly important to realise the sort of risks and consequences of your choices. You are going to be entering into a 30-year legal covenant. There's going to be considerable high capital expenditure up front. You can have ongoing costs. You can have loss of potential profits and development opportunities across that land. And ultimately, the most severe consequence of failing to comply with your legal agreement is being served an injunction by the local planning authority. And if you fail to comply with the injunction, then that is a punishable offence with a maximum 2-year imprisonment. That's not, I don't wish to scaremonger, and it's not something that should dissuade landowners from making these choices. But it's important to go into these things aware of all of the consequences and with your eyes open. And if once you appreciate all of that and you're aware of the consequences and the risks, then really the next process is baselining. So instruct an ecologist, get them down to the land, see what you're working with, what habitats exist on the site, what condition are they in, what is the baseline value of your land. If you're working with arable cropland, that's quite simple because in the metric, it's all worth 2 and there's no condition assessment. And it's a fairly straightforward process, but it's far less straightforward if you've got existing habitats, particularly where they need to be condition assessed. And just bear in mind that condition assessments are seasonally appropriate things. If you want to assess the condition of your woodland and it's December, you're not going to be able to do that whilst the trees are dormant. You're going to have to wait until the spring and they're in leaf. So there could be a sort of delay element there. But once you've got that baselining done and you understand what you're working with, then you need to work with your ecologist to draw up a habitat management and monitoring plan. And effectively, what are you going to do on that land to improve its biodiversity value? What is the new habitat that you're creating, or what is the habitat that you're enhancing, and how are you doing it? It's really your plan of what you're going to do over the 30 years, and it's that plan that generates the kind of biodiversity uplift. There is where all the detail goes as well. So that plan will be appended to your legal agreement, and really the legal agreement ought to be relatively straightforward. All of the detail is in the HMMP. It's going to set out quite thoroughly the existing baseline habitat, what exists, the sort of geology and topography of the land, where it sits relative to other designated sites, protected species recorded in the vicinity. You can have soil analysis, that sort of thing. And then it's going to be very detailed in terms of what are you going to do to create that habitat? What are you committing to? What are the condition assessments? What's the sort of assessment criteria that you need to hit? It ought to set out what remedial actions the landowner should take if they're unable to meet those condition targets at the various assessment dates. It's going to have a thorough sort of monitoring obligation and a monitoring time frame throughout the 30-year period. Really quite a chunky and detailed document.
And that's like the key plan, right, for making sure that those liabilities and risks, which you mentioned earlier, you've got a plan which is going to prevent those liabilities becoming a problem. So that's what the purpose of the document, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really setting out the detail of what those obligations are. It's the legal agreement, the Section 106 or the Conservation Covenant will really be what binds the landowner, but the detail is in the HMMP, and it's important that it's devised by a competent independent ecologist, right? This isn't something that a landowner should be just scribbling up themselves. You need to seek expert advice and input here and competency. But it is a sort of collaborative approach, right? Because it's committing the landowner to what they're going to do. So it needs to be realistic. It needs to be achievable. It needs to be flexible. I think they're the 3 key takeaways from a recent Natural England blog. I think they asked 3 ecologists to give some advice as to how landowners and ecologists should prepare these. And yeah, make sure what you're committing to is realistic and achievable. And also make sure it has some flexibility, because it needs to be watertight. It needs to be prepared with an aim that the landowner commits to it and it delivers the habitat to that condition. But inevitably, we're working in an environment that is far less easy to predict than it was decades ago. And we're going to have periods of drought and flooding that might impact the successful establishment of a habitat. And what that plan needs to do is set out how we go about overcoming those challenges. Rather than just simply what are the kind of penalties for failing to meet those condition assessments.
And then there's planning and consenting. So what happens at that stage?
Yep. So that same HMMP, as I've mentioned, that would be appended to your legal agreement. That's actually going to be the document that effectively secures the biodiversity enhancement and enables you to sell units. Now, that could be a Section 106 agreement with a local planning authority. It could be a conservation covenant with a responsible body. There has been a lot of discussion, I think too much discussion recently between those two. What are the differences and the pros and the cons? Really, the two are the same document, or at least they ought to be in how they operate. It's just one of them is entered into with a local planning authority under the Town and Country Planning Act, and the other is with a responsible body through the Environment Act. Clearly, there is a preference to going down the Section 106 route if what you're delivering requires planning permission. So if you're creating a habitat such as a lake that requires excavatory works, that's going to satisfy the definition of development, and you're going to need planning permission to do that. Clearly, in that instance, having a planning application for your development that's accompanied by 106 that generates your biodiversity units that's the preferred option. It's streamlined. If, like phase 1 of Langley Abbey, you don't need planning permission to drill wildflower seed rather than barley, for example, then you could go down the responsible body conservation covenant route. I say that in theory. Right now, you would struggle because there's only one responsible body, and that's Natural England. They've made it very clear that they won't be a responsible body beyond the credit pilot schemes. Yeah. But in due course, I know there's at least half a dozen applications that are currently being processed for the sort of next round of RBs. So hopefully before too long, there's another avenue to go down there.
And thanks. You've answered what would be my next question, which is around what's the difference between a Section 106 and a conservation covenant. But I think we'll move on from that one to talk a little bit about monitoring and management. Habitats can take time to complete, often years. I mean, woodland is 30 years plus in some cases, but how does that impact on the sale and the value of the credits?
Yeah, it's a good question, because you're right, many habitats take a long time to establish. I think what's important to distinguish here is between creation and establishment. And so let's take woodland, for example. You're looking at probably, best part of 2, maybe 3 decades before that woodland is established to maturity. But unless you actually go about the initial works of planting saplings to actually create that woodland, then it's never going to be established. There's always, for any habitat, there's an initial kind of capital project that constitutes its creation. And how BNG really operates is you are able to generate units that you can then sell on the strength that you have legally committed to maintain that habitat through to establishment for a minimum of 30 years. And it's that strength of the legal obligation that you committed to that enables you to sell the units before the habitat has been established.
Perfect. And once you've sold the units, can you do anything else with that land? What do you need to provide to the buyer, other stakeholders afterwards? What do you need to provide? Do you need to provide updates year on year? Is that something which is useful, needed, required?
Update, you might find that a buyer wants to be updated annually on the progress of the habitat that they've invested in. It's not a legal requirement, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if some developers asked for that. What they will definitely want you to do once they've bought any units from you is to allocate them to their development rather. And any sale purchase agreement or allocation agreement ought to have an obligation on the landowner to do that within a certain time period. The local planning authority, or maybe even the responsible body, they may want to be updated when a unit is sold. Again, that's not a legal requirement. It's the biodiversity gain site register that sort of ensures transparency and prevents double selling. But I wouldn't be surprised if some LPAs also wanted written notice every time a habitat bank draw down upon the land that they're generating units on. I think you asked about use of the land. Ultimately, the use of the land ought to be to create the habitat and maintain it. You're not precluded from doing other actions so long as they don't compromise or undermine the successful establishment of that habitat. Grazing livestock through the winter on a meadow is something that you can do with that land. But beyond those sort of few examples, I think you really just need to consider the primary focus, which is ensuring the successful establishment of that habitat.
And can you say a little bit more about the obligations then? Costs of monitoring management over time, is there any impact whatsoever for the buyer of the credit?
Not in terms of monitoring and management, no. There's absolutely no cost implications for the purchaser of a unit. Management costs fall on the landowner. They're difficult to predict over a 30-year period. You need to make sure that they're factored into the pricing of units. Monitoring costs, again, fall to the landowner. They probably twofold. You're looking at paying for an ecologist to monitor the land in accordance with the monitoring schedule. They will, in most instances, prepare a monitoring report that's then submitted to the local planning authority or the responsible body. So you're looking at a second cost there when that monitoring report is effectively audited by the LPA, and they're going to charge a fee for that. It might be an upfront fee when you complete your legal agreement. It might be annually or in accordance with the monitoring report coming in, payment within a certain time frame. But it's a double cost there. But it falls upon the landowner. At no point would the purchaser of the units be required to cover those costs. They do in some sense through the pricing of the units, but it's not a direct cost that falls on them.
So if anything goes wrong, who's responsible for the correction? Is there any impact on the buyer, or is that fully on the landowner?
Yeah, same principle. The responsibility solely falls on the landowner. It's one of the things that makes offsite unit delivery so convenient, not just for biodiversity in terms of maximizing what can be achieved for nature, but also for the development sector and offloading costs and liabilities for a 30-year period. The enforcement powers are between the local planning authority, or the responsible body, and the landowner delivering the habitat creation. There's no liability there with the developer who's purchased the units.
Wonderful. Let's move on to what you do when you're selling. So can you tell us a bit about how you sell units right now and how that may differ from other environmental banks?
Yeah, of course, we sell our units directly, so we don't make use of a broker or a habitat bank operator. What that means is that all of the money that goes towards buying units from Lang Abbey Environment Project is invested in the long-term maintenance of the project. It also enables us to be as competitive as we can with pricing because we're not losing any of the sale proceeds to a middleman. The challenge for a lot of landowners is going to be how do you market those units and how do you really get traction? And that's probably for some going to mean bringing on additional resource, additional expertise, or it's going to mean you need to make use of a broker. That's where a good broker can come in handy. They ought to have an established network of connections on the developer side, and they can obviously match up your supply with the demand for units. The downside of utilising a broker is that it's going to come at a cost. It's likely to be a percentage of the overall sale proceeds. That might undermine the viability of your project, and it might mean you're less able to be competitive on pricing. Yeah, again, there's no right or wrong solution.
And is there a central market at all, or how does Natural England provide some details through the registration process?
The Natural England register is definitely not a marketplace. It's simply there to ensure transparency and accountability. There are some emerging marketplaces that are coming forward, such as Gaia and Terra Exchange, just a couple that I'm aware of. And the Future Homes Hub also have a sort of interactive map where units can be advertised. The problem that all of those marketplaces have for the time being is that there's only 2 offsite habitat banks on the game register, and they've only gone up in the last few days. Whilst there's an array of options of advertised units on each of those platforms, at the minute, I guess it's a bit like looking in a shop window, but the shop's not open for another 20 minutes. And that's the challenge for the time being. Hopefully, as LPAs get a bit more support in resourcing and start to become more familiar with the process, and maybe some responsible bodies come forward and start sharing that load a bit, we'll see more sites coming forward, more agreements completed, and yeah, more choice for developers actually needing to purchase units.
And presumably units can be traded after the sale, so from a buyer to another buyer, it can be traded like a commodity, can it? If it's not used.
Yes, in theory, whether they can really work would be dependent on whether they've been allocated to a development, and then beyond that, whether that development has actually been implemented. So in theory, you could have a situation where a developer buys some units, they discharge their biodiversity gain condition, but they don't actually implement the planning permission. And in that instance, then they would be able to sell those units to another developer because they don't need to rely upon the biodiversity enhancements because they're not carrying out the development that needs to deliver net gain. So absolutely, in theory, that could work. The concern that I would have is that it's slightly, with that sort of secondary market right now, would slightly muddy the waters at a time where a lot of people are still trying to get up to speed with how BNG works in its purest sense. And it can be quite straightforward. And I think we're not far from the penny dropping for a lot of organizations. So yeah, we may well see it evolve in that way. And there's certainly no reason why it shouldn't. But for the time being, I think this sort of simple primary purchase and allocation and implementation is definitely the way forward.
So let's just move on to this last section here. I just want to talk a little bit about what the difference it would be if it was for internal trading purposes. So is the process you've described the same for credits within a group? So if it's within a developer has multiple sites, they've retained some land effectively to become internal habitat banks for off-site development purposes. Is the process you've described the same? Would they register all the credits on that land estate and then effectively draw down upon that land bank for their own developments as off-site credits?
Yeah, the process would be exactly the same. And by all means, that's something that may evolve developers utilising sites for habitat creation instead of development. And like you say, having their own habitat bank to draw down upon across their development portfolio. The process would be the same. I think practically most developers would have to do one of two things, probably bring on additional resource to create and manage and maintain those habitats for 30 years, or contract that out to a third party. Both of those have cost implications. And I suppose you'd have to weigh up and consider at what point does it become cost effective and practical to deliver it yourself, opposed to paying a third party landowner to do it on their land at their cost and at their risk.
And last question for me before we wrap up. Are there any last tips that you have for the audience today from your experience at Langley?
Yeah, it's more of a sort of holistic overview of BNG rather than a sort of practical tip. But BNG is not perfect, but it is a fantastic opportunity for us to improve the state of nature in this country, and utilising landscape scale, strategically located offsite units like we have at Langley Abbey is a real vital piece of that puzzle. I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago. I heard an ecologist describe projects like ours as developer-funded nature reserves. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Clearly, on-site habitat creation is an important piece of the puzzle too. And as a lawyer, I'm well aware of the biodiversity hierarchy that has to be adhered to. But developer-funded nature reserves, or however you want to view them, have got to be the way that we maximise our collective efforts. And it's really exciting what we can do at Langley and other projects when you collate funds and land in that way. It's a little bit cliche to end on the Lawton principles these days of bigger, better, and more joined up, but they really are the sort of guiding mantra that's going to help us make best use of biodiversity net gain.
Fantastic. Thank you, Henry. So I'm just going to summarise a little bit here, but first of all, I just want to say thank you for Henry participating and telling us about Langley Abbey Environmental Project. Also wanted to say thank you. I think we had some questions earlier on, and one of them said they couldn't make the webinar today. Is it being recorded? Yes, it is, and it will be on Ash's webpage, so please do check that out. You'll still have an opportunity to, if you go onto BNG AI, to check out some of the blogs as well. We'll get those up in the next couple of days as well. So please do check out that webpage. I think there's still a few free projects available as well on that webpage, so please do interact and see what's available in that space. I'm going to summarize by saying there's many different ways to develop land for BNG, but it's pretty clear that location, scale, context of the site influence the decision of what can and perhaps should be developed locally and the potential value. And I'm sure consideration to the local demand for credits is clearly part of that decision as well when it comes to which natural capital market to target. Key to note the differences in habitat banks. I think that was evident here today with what Henry said, with a large scale project selling directly to the market, usually through within or near the NCA boundaries. Other banks working with landowners to offer credits nationwide as brokerage kind of opportunities. And I think you mentioned there's lots of great links to keep an eye on through the Future Homes Hub. If you a landowner, clearly the commercial decisions to when to start habitat restoration, and the association with the legal covenants as well. Upfront investment requires that finance to establish the bank or the habitat. If you wait for somebody to buy and then you put the covenants in place, it may have a detrimental impact. So do just work through the value of the credits that are being generated and be careful there with when you set the covenants up and when you intend to actually create the habitat. And I think you mentioned the monitoring management plan as the key to both creation, but also having a very robust plan to what you will do to manage the risks, which is also exceptionally important. One of my key takeaways today actually has been what we've learned in the nuances of the metric. And when planning with your ecologist, you need to combine that impact of difficulty discounts as well as distinctiveness on what you're actually going to be choosing. On your slides earlier, you put that unit density, and that's a very important sort of way of looking at what to create. And as I said, if you don't use them, if you've created it, it will increase in value because of those temporal multipliers. So I'd like to say thanks to Henry. We've only got 5 minutes left, I'm afraid. So I'm going to cherry pick a few of the questions which we received beforehand. And the very first one, I think is probably quite astute here, but Henry, can you say a little bit about how you are pricing your units and which habitats you have available?
Yeah, of course. Phase 1 will be medium distinctiveness grassland, other neutral grassland that we are creating to a good condition. And hedgerow units are high distinctiveness, species rich hedgerows, native hedgerows with trees. Pricing is difficult, not least because of inflation. Your inflation, I saw today, the good news that it's come down to 3.4%, but even at that number, it still poses a real challenge to selling units, receiving sale proceeds up front, and then using that money to effectively maintain that habitat over the 30-year period. If you look at the average inflation for the last 30 years of, I think, 2.5%, the value of any sale proceeds you receive today is halved by the end of the covenant period. So it's one of the pressures that you have to try and reflect in your pricing. We've carried out a fairly detailed assessment to be as competitive as we can with our pricing. Our area habitats, medium distinctiveness, we are selling for £30,000 per unit, and the hedgerow units are £33,000 per unit. That really represents the sort of as competitive as we can be while still making it a sensible decision and viable across the 30-year covenant period.
Fantastic. And I'm going to ask one last question, which is actually on the chat function here. And I think what we will do after this is probably try and capture your thoughts, Henry, at some stage and answer the questions which we've received, and just put a couple of bullet points on there as a sort of follow-up note. But I think the key one here is there any legal implications to the person buying the credit from, or like a developer, if the habitat bank fails to meet the required conditions?
Not to the developer, no. It really is that clear and simple. The enforcement is between the local planning authority and the landowner. Of course, the way the metric works with the spatial multiplier, you may often have a situation where a developer has bought units from a landowner within the same LPA boundary. So it's the same LPA that discharges the gain condition and monitors and informs the habitat bank and the landowner. But there is no recourse if the landowner fails to perform to the HMMP. There is no recourse on the developer. Yeah. It's simply between the LPA and the landowner.
Thank you very much. In fact, we do have one last question here, which I do want to ask, which is, how do BNG units impact on public access to land? Is there a risk of large natural spaces being fragmented, public access to areas being limited? What's your view on access rights? And intuitively, I feel like this is probably going to increase access rights rather than reduce them.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a concern fragmenting existing habitats. There is no requirement through BNG to deliver public access. I think what you will see, particularly with the likes of Langley Abbey and other large projects, is there will be existing public access through an estate. That will, of course, be maintained as part of the project. Some projects may bring forward more public access. I think the difficulty there, it's a kind of an age-old conundrum, is between sort of conservation efforts and human activity. So there's a bit of tension between trying to support ground nesting birds and dog walkers who tend to walk their dogs off a lead, no matter how obedient or disobedient. And yeah, there's a tension there, but I don't think certainly rolling BNG out across the country is not going to, it won't require public access to fragment existing habitats like the sort of question alludes to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. And we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to bring the show to an end, and we'll catch everybody hopefully in a month's time. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks.